Harlem had lived with violence long enough to recognize when something felt different. That night, it wasn't the sound that stopped the streets. It was the realization that a line had been crossed. News moved quickly, but without detail. People didn't describe what had happened. They didn't need to. The tone alone carried the message. This wasn't routine, and it wasn't contained. A killing had occurred in a way that unsettled even those who thought they'd seen everything. Not because it was loud, but because it felt out of control. Shops stayed open, but conversations slowed. Corners that usually buzzed went quiet. Harlem didn't panic. It paused. And in that pause, a question spread without being spoken. What happens if this goes unanswered? When word reached Bumpy Johnson, there was no immediate reaction, no visible anger, no public move to assert authority. For a neighborhood used to fast consequences, that silence was unsettling. People understood that when a response didn't come quickly, it meant the response would be structural, not emotional. This wasn't about settling a score. It was about deciding what kind of streets Harlem would accept going forward. The killing had done more than take a life. It had disrupted the balance that kept violence predictable and contained. If nothing changed, the message would be clear. Anything could happen to anyone, at any time. And that was something Harlem refused to normalize. So the neighborhood waited, not for revenge, for direction. By morning, there were no headlines announcing a crackdown, no public declarations of order restored. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. People sensed that whatever came next wouldn't target just one person. It would reset expectations for everyone. This story isn't about the act that shook Harlem. It's about what followed, and how one measured response altered the rules of the street. Because sometimes, the moment that changes everything isn't the shock itself. It's the way a community chooses to answer it. By 1950, Harlem had learned to distinguish between violence it could absorb and violence that changed the temperature of the street. This incident fell squarely into the second category. It wasn't the fact that someone had been killed. That, grim as it was, wasn't unusual. It was how the killing disrupted the rules people relied on to feel that chaos was still containable. The details mattered less than the signal. People didn't repeat specifics. They summarized. Phrases like, "It went too far," and "that wasn't supposed to happen," replaced description. In a neighborhood where information usually traveled fast and loose, the restraint was telling. Harlem understood that reliving the act would only spread instability. What made this killing different was that it broke predictability. It didn't fit into existing disputes. It didn't resolve anything. It didn't stop at a boundary people recognized. Instead, it suggested that the informal controls keeping violence limited had failed, even briefly. And once that possibility appeared, it couldn't be ignored. The immediate reaction wasn't fear. It was assessment. Corners quieted not because people were hiding, but because they were watching. Businesses stayed open, but conversations became shorter, more focused. Everyone was measuring the same thing, whether this would be treated as an exception or allowed to become precedent. That distinction mattered more than blame. In Harlem, precedent was dangerous. If something happened once without consequence, it invited repetition, not by the same people, but by others who interpreted silence as permission. This is why the killing created pressure beyond grief or anger. It threatened the logic that allowed the neighborhood to function. When the news reached Bumpy Johnson, it didn't arrive as a demand for retaliation. It arrived as a problem statement. The message wasn't, "This must be avenged." It was, "This cannot be allowed to define what comes next." That framing shaped everything that followed. Harlem wasn't asking for revenge. Revenge would be temporary. It would satisfy emotion and then fade. What the street needed was correction. Something that would make it clear this level of violence wasn't acceptable, not just to one man, but to the entire system operating around him. And that's why the killing mattered. Not because of who was lost or who was responsible, but because it exposed a fault line. Left unaddressed, that fault line would widen. Addressed incorrectly, it would trigger more instability. So the neighborhood didn't erupt. It didn't demand blood. It waited. Because in Harlem, the moments that truly changed the streets didn't begin with noise. They began when everyone recognized that the old rules were no longer enough, and new ones had to be made clear. Shock didn't move through Harlem as panic, it moved as agreement. People didn't argue about what had happened. They didn't debate motives or trade theories. The killing had already been classified by the neighborhood as something outside the acceptable range. That consensus formed quickly and quietly, without meetings or messengers. It showed itself in behavior, in how voices dropped, how routes changed, how people lingered just long enough to read the mood and then moved on. The streets felt different not because they were empty, but because they were alert. Information traveled in fragments, not details, but conclusions. That can't happen again. That's not how things work. These weren't emotional reactions. They were assessments. Harlem understood that if the shock dissipated without response, it would harden into something worse, a normalization of excess. That's when pressure began to rise, not toward the person responsible, but toward the structure that allowed the streets to function at all. People weren't asking who would be punished. They were asking whether order would reassert itself. And in Harlem, that question inevitably pointed to Bumpy Johnson, not as an executioner, but as a stabilizer. What made this moment dangerous was that it didn't belong to one dispute. It belonged to everyone. The killing had cut across lines that usually kept conflicts contained. It wasn't a warning shot between rivals. It was a rupture that suggested the controls were slipping. And when controls slip, imitation follows. That fear wasn't theoretical. Harlem had seen it before. One unaddressed act at the extreme edge invited others to push their limits. Not out of cruelty, but out of calculation. If the rules no longer held, then anything became possible, and possibility was chaos. The shock sharpened attention instead of dulling it. People began watching for signals, not for violence, but for response. Would there be immediate retaliation, a public move, a statement made through action, or would there be silence? Each option carried risk. Immediate retaliation might satisfy emotion but escalate instability. Public moves could invite outside attention and pressure. Silence, if too long, could be mistaken for tolerance. The neighborhood understood this instinctively, even if no one articulated it. That understanding made the waiting heavier. Bumpy Johnson's lack of visibility during this phase amplified the tension. His absence wasn't read as indifference. It was read as calculation. People knew that if he acted too quickly, the response would be personal. If he waited, it would be systemic, and Harlem needed systemic. As the shock spread, behavior adjusted in subtle ways. Certain conversations stopped entirely. Certain spaces went quiet without explanation. People who might normally posture or test boundaries held back. No one wanted to be the next data point in a moment when the rules were being redefined. The killing had created a vacuum, not of power but of certainty, and in that vacuum the streets weren't demanding action. They were demanding clarity. By the end of that phase, everyone understood the same thing. Whatever came next would determine not just how this incident was remembered, but what kind of violence Harlem would accept going forward. The shock had done its work. Now the response had to do more. The most unsettling thing about what came next was that nothing happened. No immediate sweep. No public confrontation. No visible assertion of control. After the shock had settled, Harlem entered a stretch of time that felt heavier than the incident itself. The pause. In a neighborhood used to fast consequences, the absence of action signaled that whatever response was coming would not be impulsive or personal. It would be deliberate. People watched the clock differently during that pause, not waiting for sirens or retaliation, but for signals. Signals of restraint, signals of intent. The streets didn't empty. They tightened. Movement continued, but with purpose. Conversations stayed short. Posturing disappeared. Everyone understood that when rules were being recalibrated, visibility carried risk. At the center of that stillness was Bumpy Johnson, notably absent from the street and just as notably present in everyone's calculations. His silence wasn't interpreted as indecision. It was interpreted as ownership. Harlem had learned that when he moved too quickly, the outcome stayed narrow. When he waited, the outcome widened, touching not just the individuals involved, but the behaviors that made incidents like this possible. That widening was the point. The pause drained emotion from the moment. Anger cooled. Fear stabilized. What remained was clarity. The killing was no longer being processed as a tragedy or a provocation. It was being processed as a failure of limits, and failures of limits required corrections that reached beyond one person. During this period, people adjusted without being told to. Certain spaces went quiet. Certain faces disappeared from view, not because they were being hunted, but because they understood that the street was being reorganized. When systems correct themselves, they do so first by removing excess. That understanding kept the pause intact. No one forced a reaction by testing boundaries. No one tried to exploit the silence. The neighborhood had learned that doing so during a recalibration was the fastest way to invite consequences meant for everyone. So restraint held, not out of fear, but out of alignment. The longer the pause lasted, the clearer the message became. This wasn't about making an example. It was about changing conditions. When conditions change, behavior follows permanently. Bumpy Johnson didn't need to communicate during this phase. His role was defined by patience. By letting the streets feel the absence of direction, he allowed them to recognize why direction was needed in the first place. That recognition mattered more than any announcement ever could. By the time the pause reached its natural end, Harlem had already adjusted its expectations. People understood that the response wouldn't target just one act. It would redraw what was acceptable going forward. The pause wasn't a delay. It was the moment the streets realized they were about to change, and that the change would be enforced not through noise, but through structure. When the response finally arrived, it didn't announce itself with force. It arrived as reorganization. There was no public display meant to satisfy anger. No sudden sweep that invited attention. Instead, the streets began to behave differently. And that difference carried intent. Spaces that had tolerated excess went quiet. Corners that had drifted into disorder lost their energy overnight. People who operated at the edge of acceptability found that the edge had moved. The response wasn't aimed at punishment. It was aimed at prevention. What changed first were patterns. Movement became more measured. Interactions shortened. The kind of behavior that had allowed the killing to happen found fewer places to land. Not because it was chased out, but because it was starved of support. Harlem didn't need to name the problem. It removed the conditions that made the problem possible. This was the difference between retaliation and correction. Retaliation answers an act. Correction answers a system. And the system that allowed uncontrolled violence to surface had just been adjusted, quietly, comprehensively. The message didn't need repetition because it was embedded in daily life. Anyone paying attention could feel it. At the center of this shift was Bumpy Johnson, not as a visible enforcer, but as a reference point. He didn't claim credit. He didn't appear to direct traffic. His influence showed up in what no longer happened. When behavior changes without orders, authority has already done its work. Importantly, the response avoided spectacle. Spectacle invites challenge. Challenge invites escalation. Harlem had learned that lesson too well. By keeping the correction understated, the neighborhood denied outsiders any leverage to interfere or misinterpret what was happening. The result was stability, not silence born of fear, but order born of clarity. People understood that the killing had reset the line, and the response had fixed it in place. Violence didn't disappear, but its shape did. Acts that felt uncontrolled or excessive stopped finding oxygen. Disputes resolved earlier. Limits were respected without discussion. This was the outcome Harlem needed. Not a warning, not an example, a recalibration. By the time the response settled fully, the streets no longer felt shaken. They felt contained. The shock had been answered not with noise but with structure, and structure held. Because in Harlem, the most effective responses were the ones that didn't end a problem. They made sure it couldn't happen the same way again. The change didn't announce itself as an ending. It showed up as a new normal. In the days that followed, Harlem didn't feel subdued. It felt recalibrated. The streets still moved. Businesses still opened. Conversations returned. But the edge that had allowed excess to surface was gone. What had been tolerated before was no longer finding room to exist. That was the real response. Violence didn't vanish, and no one expected it to. What disappeared was a specific kind of behavior, the kind that ignored limits, that treated chaos as acceptable collateral. After the killing, and after the quiet reorganization that followed, those behaviors stopped appearing in public spaces, not because people were afraid, but because the rules had been clarified. At the center of that clarity was Bumpy Johnson, not as a figure issuing commands, but as a constant reference. The streets didn't need to be told what had changed. They could see it in who was present and who wasn't, in which corners stayed active and which ones lost their pull, in how quickly disputes now resolved before crossing into something uncontrollable. This was the difference between shock and transformation. The killing had shaken Harlem. The response reshaped it. People adjusted their behavior without needing reminders. Excess wasn't challenged. It was ignored out of existence. Those who relied on disorder found fewer opportunities. Those who preferred predictability found the streets easier to read. The balance shifted toward containment, not through pressure, but through shared understanding. What mattered most was that the change held. Weeks passed without the pattern slipping back. The absence of repetition confirmed that the response had worked. Harlem didn't need to keep correcting itself because the conditions that led to the shock had been removed. Once that happened, enforcement became unnecessary. This is why the moment endured. Not as a story about a killing, but as a turning point where the neighborhood decided what kind of violence it would no longer absorb. The streets didn't change because they were threatened. They changed because they were aligned. And once alignment replaces fear, order stops being temporary. It becomes the way things are done. That was the lasting effect of 1950. Not a show of power, but a reset of expectations that quietly shaped Harlem for years to come. What changed Harlem in 1950 wasn't the brutality of the killing. It was the decision about what would be allowed to follow it. The shock alone could have led to chaos. Fear could have spread. Retaliation could have multiplied. Instead, the neighborhood chose structure over reaction. The response wasn't designed to satisfy anger. It was designed to remove the conditions that made excess possible. That distinction is why the streets changed. This wasn't about Bumpy Johnson proving dominance. He didn't need to. His role wasn't to punish, but to allow the system to correct itself without spectacle. By waiting, by avoiding noise, by refusing to personalize the response, the outcome became permanent rather than emotional. Harlem learned something critical in that moment. Violence doesn't destabilize a neighborhood on its own. What destabilizes it is unanswered excess. Once the line is redrawn and held, fear fades. Predictability returns. Life continues. And that's what happened here. After 1950, the streets didn't become quiet because people were intimidated. They became quieter because people understood the limits again. Disputes stayed contained. Behavior adjusted earlier. The kind of violence that had shaken the neighborhood stopped finding space to exist. No announcements marked the shift. No public credit was taken. But the change held, which is how everyone knew it was real. This story isn't about one death. It's about how a community decided what it would no longer tolerate. Because when a neighborhood responds to shock with discipline instead of chaos, power doesn't need to shout. It reshapes the streets and lets the streets enforce the lesson themselves.